when we begin a hymn addressed to God, God of grace and God of glory, we are making a request. On thy people, pour thy power. And so together we have prayed. Let the body of Christ say together, Amen. 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 It is truly an extraordinary gift to be here. It feels like old home week. I walk in and feel like, oh, I'm back with the fam. When I left, you may remember, I talked about with our children the blessing of family reunions and what a blessing it is to know that I have this extended family across the connection, across the country, and you are such a precious part of that family for me. It was a beautiful gift to receive the invitation to come and be with you for a few moments today. And I didn't get there have been a few things going on. I served as a delegate from Baltimore, Washington annual conference to the 2016 conference and to the recent 2019 conference. And in addition to that, was providing some leadership for some organizing going on around the edges and behind the scenes. And so in addition to, people in churches, when you're the senior pastor, they expect you to show up and say something every week, which, really, like, they're so demanding. Anyway, So I've been a little busy, and in pulling together things for today, I had hoped to have PowerPoint and all that kind of thing, but you're just going to have to, I'll try to make it interesting enough without pictures. How about that? I want to start, I'm going to be speaking, I was invited to speak on the book that I wrote last year. I was invited to write a book at the end of 2016, leading into 2017. Abingdon Press called and asked if I would write a book based on a hashtag I had been using on social media, hashtag sacred resistance. And they said, we think there's a book in that and we want you to write it. And I said, no, I'm too busy. And then I had a clear sense of God calling me to say yes. And so I did it kind of under protest, as I've spent much of my ministry under protest. But I was invited by the United Methodist Women, who, by the way, I want to extend my gratitude to Lisa and the whole crew who made the decision to invite me to come and speak with you today. So I was invited to talk about the book, and I know that for some it might be challenging, and I don't mind going there. So we're going to have some conversation about that. I'm going to share some thoughts from the book, certainly not the whole thing. But I want to start with a poem from Wendell Berry. And I want you, as I'm reading the poem, I want you just to listen, kind of picture in your mind's eye the picture that he's painting. And I want to invite you to think about how this poem feels connected to some of the dynamics in our culture and in our church. So hear these words. After the bitter nights and the gray, cold days comes a bright afternoon. I go into the creek valley, and there are the horses, the black and the white, lying in the warm shine on a bed of dry hay. They lie side by side, identically posed as a painter might imagine them. Heads up, ears and eyes alert. They are beautiful in the light and in the warmth, happy. Such harmonies are rare. This is not the way the world is. It is a possibility, nonetheless, deeply seated within the world. It is the way the world is sometimes. Any of you who are on social media and may follow me on Facebook know I love Wendell Berry. He's one of my favorites. And one of the things I love about this poem is that it embedded in the image is a wide open, eyes wide open acknowledgement of things as they are, and the hope that is always there too. This is, did you notice that? Yeah. This is not the way the world is. And yet there is this possibility deeply seated within the world. This is the way the world is sometimes. It is possible. And I believe that this kind of proclamation is what the church is called to share, to tell the truth. This is the way it is. Look, see what's real. See what is broken. See what's not working. See where there's pain. And to also proclaim hope in the midst and the possibility that is always there. I believe that this is what God does for us. God sees us as we are and knows the possibility within us and has hope in us and is always calling us into that more full, more healed, more mended life towards wholeness. So I believe this is the work of the church in every age, in every time, and in every place. To be engaged in what is going on in real human life and human community, to name and respond to that which is not right, not just, not whole, and proclaim and bring real hope into the midst. This is not easy work because, as the poem says, harmonies are rare. It is hard. When we look at the world, sometimes life can feel like chaos, like we are in a storm. There are, as we know, a number of stories involving storms in the Bible. They're usually at sea in the Bible. In fact, our biblical tradition, in the ancient Near Eastern traditions that influence the biblical texts, the sea and really any large body of water were symbols of chaos. In the beginning, the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, and a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. That formless void of the deep waters in the original Hebrew is translated, I don't know if I ever talked to y'all about this, but I love it. The original Hebrew of this sort of formless void, deep water thing is tohu wabohu in the Hebrew. It's very fun. It's fun to say. You want to say it? Tohu wabohu. That's, yeah. It's this sort of formlessness and normlessness. It's chaos. The wind of God blew over the chaos. In chaos, this tohu wabohu is unpredictable. It's strong and powerful and potentially destructive, just like the sea can be. In the face of these swirling waters and crashing waves, we, if we're in a boat over the tohu wabohu, can become very aware of our vulnerability and, quite frankly, our powerlessness to do anything about that. And we get really clear about that. A story from the Gospels that involves these kinds of chaotic waters is Matthew 8, 23 through 27. And when Jesus got into the boat, his disciples followed him. A windstorm rose on the sea, so great that the boat was being swamped by the waves. But he, remember what he was doing? He was asleep. And they went and woke him up, saying, "Lord, save us, we are perishing." And he said to them, "Why are you afraid, you of little faith?" And then he got up and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was dead calm. They were amazed, saying, "What sort of man is this, that even the winds and the sea obey him?" In the ancient church, one of the symbols for the church was a boat. And one of the first pictures of any Christian symbol anywhere, one of the oldest ones they found down in the catacombs, is a really simple outline of a boat. And the boat, this ancient symbol for the church, really represents God's people and all the resources that are part of the church. And so the story reminds us, Jesus got on a boat and the disciples followed him onto the boat. What do we know about the boat? Well, in the boat there are other people. In the boat there's a shared story and a shared identity. Why are you on the boat? Because you followed Jesus onto the boat. So there's sort of this common sense of why we're there. In the boat we're all supposed to contribute, and we're all supposed to work together to navigate and to stay afloat. In the boat, there's one place to eat, and everybody gets fed from that one thing. You got to share. In the boat, it can feel crowded, and we may be next to someone who aggravates us. It happens from time to time. From time to time. The boat we're in is supposed to be piloted by Jesus. That's the vision, that's the plan. The point being, we're not in charge of the destination. You get in the boat, Jesus is in the boat, Jesus knows where it's going, you're just following, you're in the boat. All right. So the thing is that boats, if you're in a boat, boats are gonna hit storms. And the truth is that this tohu wabohu, this chaos, is always there. If you're on a boat, you're always traversing chaos. If water sort of is representative of that, there is always chaos around. And some of the storms that are happening all the time somewhere can cause disruption to the boat and to those in it. What are some of the storms? Conflict, violence, injustice, oppression, suffering, grief, alienation. The list could go on. This is part of what causes disruption, part of what stirs the storms and feeds the tohu wabohu. Now, what I want to suggest is that living on the boat, serving alongside others, can prepare you to know how to respond and who to trust in the midst of the storm. A lot of times I think in the midst of all the things that go on in the world, even people who have been grounded in the church their whole life don't consider the resources of the church their primary resource for how to respond to the things going on in the public square, or the things they're even dealing with at home. Maybe, maybe not. What I've discovered as I've gone around doing some teaching and preaching here, there, and elsewhere is that a lot of people in a lot of churches are not hearing the connection between their faith and the things that they're grappling with and that are breaking their hearts and giving them lots of anxiety in the other parts of their lives. There's this disconnect. That's part of what I hope, what I wrote about, can be helpful, to try to make some connections between those things. What are some of the resources that the church offers us? Well, we can name some of them. One another is the first one. Christ is another. Peace, prayer, shared work, a sense of guidance, a sense of story and identity, and then all the gifts and practices of the church. Studying together, sacrament, serving. That's where we learn how to be strong in the midst of the challenges. Lots of resources for us on the boat. The problem is that where the church, I believe, is the primary, or should be, can be, is created to be the primary resource for human people to figure out how to navigate the tohu wabohu and respond in some faithful way to the challenges of life and community. Instead of that, a lot of times the tragedy is that instead of the church practicing these alternative ways of living together in love and intention and responding to the needs of this world with justice and compassion, instead of that, the church becomes a primary part of the problem. Religion generally, and church specifically, has been engaged and complicit in all sorts of harm instead of bringing healing in many cases. So what I want to say too is that getting on the boat, here's one thing that some people have sometimes thought, that if you just climb into the boat with Jesus, then you can get away from the world. I'm going to climb in the boat with Jesus, and that is going to shield and shelter me, and I'm not going to have to deal with all that stuff. And certainly when I come to church, do you see where I'm going? When I come to church, I'm not going to have to deal with any of that stuff. The boat, I want to point out, in Matthew 8, 23 to 27, that story of the disciples, I'm really struck by that one line at the beginning of the story where it says, Jesus got onto the boat and the disciples followed him. So the disciples chose to get on the boat. Jesus, around that story, the other stories around that little vignette are stories of Jesus healing, calling other people to follow, to leave the familiar thing and go do the harder thing that he's doing, crossing cultural and religious boundaries, and exorcism. All of those things that I just named have both personal and social consequences. That's not just sort of a personal life thing. All that stuff rippled out into the communities where that work was happening. The boat, you see in the story, is going from one place of need and struggle to another. Sometimes we might think that we can navigate culture and get on the boat and therefore just focus on spiritual things and get away from all that other stuff. This leads us to often think that we can't ever talk about, who wants to say it with me, politics in church. Now, while I support the desire to create a space guarded against the rancor and the bruising speech of partisan politics, the church is not the place to have nasty political debates. That's not what I'm suggesting. I do believe, however, that wherever the Bible is read, politics, in its true sense, is present. So kind of my provocative statement is that if you don't want politics in church, then you should never, ever read the Bible in church. The word politics, just to break it down, the word politics derives from the Greek word, who knows it, polis, meaning city or body of citizens, and therefore it has to do with the way that human beings live in community. And we know, if we read the story, which I know all of you do, that the biblical story is a story of a God who from the very beginning is focused not on things sort of out there, but is focused on the world, created the world, wants to be in relationship with the world, is constantly trying to mend the world, is like deeply present with us. The God we serve is a God who from the very beginning is focused on the world and pays attention to the way that human beings live in community, and who cares about what we do and how we do it, who desires that we live in love and in mutuality and in reverence for all of creation and for the dignity of all human life. I want to just throw a question out. Who are some of those folk in the Bible who engaged in what we might call politics for the sake of God's call in their lives, or in the life of in the community? Who in the Bible engaged in politics? Any thoughts? Jesus. Who else? John the Baptist. Paul. The disciples. Moses. Pretty much everybody. Pretty much everybody. I do that just to sort of try to get us to get clear about what we're talking about. The whole story is about people who are called by God to engage the powers and the principalities in some way in order to speak a word of love and hope, to be with in a real way those who are suffering, because that's where God is calling them. Jesus, the fulfillment of the prophetic tradition, came into the world that they might have life. I want to suggest that often gets read as sort of life in the next world, but the whole story is about life in this one. And how we live life in this one, I believe, is what matters as we prepare for life in the next. Jesus says his job description in Luke chapter 4, some of you will remember it. He was quoting and reading from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me. Why? Because the Lord has anointed me to do what? To preach good news to whom? To the poor. And who else? Recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, which, by the way, has to do with an economic justice plan called Jubilee. How can we read the Bible and say we can't talk about politics? It's not can we talk about them, it's how. And where do we start? And what's the goal? We may come at these questions, and we do, from very different perspectives. But the call, I don't think can be argued. It can be argued. But I think it's there. I mean, that's clearly what I want to press you to consider. So the primary point here is this, that following Jesus onto the boat does not save you from the messy and painful realities of the world. I would like to suggest that it leads you more deeply into them. Which doesn't feel very good. It's like, well, who wants that? God needs us to want that. So anyway, it's hard work. It's hard work. All of this is hard work. So how do we then begin to engage? I'm going to lift up a few thoughts, practices, sort of high-level practices that I think make a big difference. And the first is listening. From James chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. You must understand this, my beloved. Let everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger, for your anger does not produce God's righteousness. There is nothing quite like the experience of truly being heard. To be heard is to be seen. It's to be acknowledged. It's to be honored. To be received. To be recognized as a person of dignity who has a voice and a unique experience of life. To listen to another person is a profound act of respect and care. And to listen deeply requires practice and often patience. It's something I think we might agree that's become increasingly difficult in our culture. Our culture is very noisy. There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of distraction. We are overwhelmed with information constantly. Overwork, overstimulation. And listening is something that really is countercultural in that cultural context. Because it takes time and it takes focus and attention. It requires that we focus on someone other than ourselves. And to do this well, a few things that we might guard against. First, thinking that you can correct another person's experience. You don't need to. Another person's experience is their experience. To listen is to receive it. It's just to listen. You don't have to agree. You don't have to try to change it. You don't have to try to fix it. Listening is listening. Listening for understanding, listening to hear them. Another thing to guard against is assuming you already know what another person is thinking. We get along so well that if I'm talking about something and have a thought about something and you're talking to me, then I'm going to assume that you're thinking what I'm thinking. So I'm going to read into what you're saying. You hear where I'm going with that? It's just a thing to be mindful of. Come at it and know that this person is going to have their own thoughts. Receive their thoughts. Another thing is imagining that you have the answer to the problem when it is likely the problem isn't even what you imagine. So this goes back to kind of trying to fix stuff. If you don't, anyway, these are some things to be mindful of. The other thing that I want to suggest is not being aware of your privilege. Now, privilege is a trigger word these days, amen? But guess what? I'm going to use it and press it because it matters. So if you're trying to listen to someone, then if you are not aware of your own space, the space that you are inhabiting, the power that you have, the privilege that you have, and every one of us has some, depending on where we are and what the relationship is. So being aware of your privilege, whether that is the privilege that's afforded by your race or your education or wealth or your title or your role, be mindful of that as you are listening to the voices of others. And when you are in a place of privilege, then the encouragement, and maybe this is the encouragement generally, is to speak less, though some people have been told and trained that they need to be quiet. So I don't want to tell everybody in this room to speak less. Some people need to speak up. I'm very serious. There are some people who because of all sorts of power dynamics and prejudice and racism and various other things, have been told that they need to. So what I want to say is, if you are sitting in a space of privilege, speak less and listen more. And listen first. And speak to ask questions that help you listen more fully. So when you speak, use that opportunity to understand the other more, rather than to put your own stuff out. Create space for other people. Here's a big one. Be willing, this one's hard. Be willing to hear things that make you uncomfortable, sad, or angry. That's really hard. Be willing to hear things that make you uncomfortable, sad, or angry. Manage then your own emotional responses when someone says something that makes you uncomfortable. And when it's your turn to speak, try to do so with humility that's born of love and self-awareness. I mentioned trigger words a minute ago. Right now, listening is really, really hard, partly because the culture is so wound so tightly, and that a lot of times if you hear one word, it just blows you up. You see one name, you hear one name of some person, and all of a sudden you shut down. If that person has said that word, if that person has named that name, I don't want to hear anything else they're saying. Are you picking up when I'm laying down here? And it is hard to stay engaged when you get triggered by certain ideas or words or concepts, to stay and really try to listen. That is a discipline, and it's hard. I think it's what we're called to do, and particularly in this kind of moment in our cultural history. I'm going to move on, but before I do, I just want to say, we can hear some of this stuff. These are things that you might sort of go, oh yeah, okay, but that only matters if you begin to try to practice them And these things do take practice. Absolutely take, like any spiritual practice, you got to keep at it. God will be gracious with you. Keep trying. The second kind of high-level practice that I want to suggest for ways that we might engage this culture and present moment as followers of Jesus is what I call looking for the human face in every issue. Looking for the human face in every issue. A story from Luke chapter 13. Jesus is having a few choice words for folks that were not responding to the needs of a woman on the Sabbath. And he says, "You hypocrite, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his donkey from the manger and lead it away to give it water? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 long years, be set free from this bondage on the Sabbath day?" These days, we might talk about that encounter based on the issue of breaking the Sabbath, which is an issue. That was a big issue. But what are we missing when we talk about the issue? You're missing the woman's face, the thirst of the woman who needed something. And I had one of my really wise mentors has taught me that as soon as we start talking about things in this broad category, or certainly as we start using stereotypes, she says, when you use a stereotype, there is no more personal connection. Personal connection is gone. The person or the group loses any sense of personhood and becomes like an object, a thing, a faceless blob, without a history, without a heart, without dignity. In our focus on issues, we do this politically, we do this in the church, our focus on issues, people often get lumped into a stereotyped identity or perspective. I can't count the number of times that a lesbian or gay friend has said, "I am not an issue. I am not an issue." This is how we talk about it, and we then lose the very real, incarnate realities of very diverse people that are in our churches and in our communities. No human being is an issue, but rather a complex and unique person, beloved child of God, deeply original. And we really struggle, I don't know why, but we really struggle to remember that even people who seem to be just like us are really not just like us. None of us are just like anyone. We forget that human beings are complicated and should always be received and addressed as such. I want to share, it's a little bit hard, but I'm going to just lift it up. There's a concept that has been around a while. It's called intersectionality. Who's heard the word intersectionality? Handful of people. Intersectionality is a way to name and begin to address the ways that people become invisible in movements. It began with a woman who was particularly focusing on black women. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw is the scholar and teacher who introduced this concept. And it was a way to begin to address the ways that people become invisible. For example, when talking about racism, certainly back some years ago when she first started teaching, when you would talk about racism, then what often would come to mind, or the people that folk would talk about, would be black men as the subjects. When talking about feminism, women's rights, who would be the primary subjects that would tend to come to mind? White women. Now, in both of those issues, justice issues, talking about racism and talking about feminism, black women are in both of those categories, and yet they, generally speaking, are like kind of the silent partners who are not getting heard from and certainly not focused on. So it was a way to begin saying we are focusing, even when we're trying to do justice, we're ending up making people invisible. And so intersectionality, I think, is it's becoming more and more part of the work that folks that are trying to be inclusive and trying to welcome all people and with dignity are really using as a tool. This sort of analytic sensibility tool can help us remember the complexities of human beings and of societies. And in a world that's already so complicated and overwhelming, it's much easier to just assign people to a clearly marked box. We sort of put people in their categories. And this is trying to make things, no, it's not trying to make things more complicated. It's trying to help us see the complicated nature of things so that we can be truly present and more lovingly responsive. Does this make sense? It's kind of a high-level concept. I'm putting it out there. I'm lobbing it out there. For those of you who are interested, you can go do some more reading. Okay. So listening and humility, seeing the human face in every issue. Another practice, and this is another one that may be one of the real foundations of the whole ball game, is keeping crisis in perspective. Keeping crisis in perspective. Psalm 46. Anybody know Psalm 46? God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth should change, though the mountains shake in the heart of the sea. You might know this verse, be still and know that I am God. Keep crisis in perspective. This practice of keeping crisis in perspective can really only be achieved in the context of holding this larger vision of God, who is the God of all and who is holding all and the one in whom we live and move and have our being. This vision that sees beyond the present moment and beyond what can be easily perceived. Without this larger vision, every eruption of new violence, wherever that's happening, or injustice, can feel like the end of days. Some terrible thing happens and we think it's the end. Because unmoored from history, unmoored from context or scripture or community, senseless, banal acts of evil and destruction will tempt us to reactivity, fight or flight, instead of reasoned, thoughtful, faithful response. That's one of the things I've done a lot too over the last few years, is to try to use those as categories. Are we reacting? Sort of, that's the reptilian brain response, fight or flight. Or are we responding from a place of thoughtful, prayerful, theologically and biblically grounded faith? Those are different options. One takes a lot of work. The other one doesn't. So which one do you think gets used more? And we see the results of that out and about and everywhere. Yes, we do, I think. So we know perspective is how we hold reality, how we frame and understand it. And if our framework, if our perspective is God's saving love always at work for the healing and the wholeness of the world, then we hold moments of crisis differently than if that was not our frame. You see what I'm saying? We are reminded that whatever is happening is not all about me, but it's rather part of this much larger experience. We're given the gift of knowing that we are not alone. Some people really don't have that because they're not holding whatever's happening in the framework of God's presence. We're given the gift of knowing that God is with us, that there are other people with whom to share the struggle and the work of mending. will have the benefit of memory, the awareness that the work of cultivating God's reign on earth as it is in heaven has been going on. When did that start? When did God's mending work begin? Tohu wabohu, people. From the beginning. From the beginning. So this work of healing, of saving, of mending is not something that's just starting right now. We'll have at least a vague sense in the midst of crisis, of whatever that may be, where our energies should be directed, and that is generally towards those most adversely affected by whatever the current devastation is. These are only some of the benefits of the spiritual practice of keeping perspective. The practice is only, I want to suggest, the practice is only possible to sustain if we remain connected to that larger holistic vision. And doing that requires the help of others who share that vision. Who might those people be? Us. The church. That's you people. That's one of the reasons why engagement in this kind of work that you do day in, day out, week in, week out at St. Matthew's matters so much. It's because you are helping stay connected to that larger vision. It also requires regular engagement with the rituals and narratives of our faith so that you know the story. It also requires close contact with the God whose grace beckons us toward the vision in the first place. And how do we do that? Prayer. What have I just described? Christian community. Where did I start? Christian community. It's very political. Another aspect, I'm going to run out of time. When do I need to stop? All right. I have a stopping point, by the way. I do have a stopping point. So another aspect of keeping perspective is the whole issue of the forest and the trees. Like, where do you start? In the midst of a crisis, when something has happened that's really hard, do you focus on the thing that's right in front of you, or do you go to the larger issue that caused the thing that's right in front of you? So if something has gotten broken, do you try to mend the broken thing, or do you say, why did that get broken, and try to go deal with that? You see what I mean? Sort of micro-macro question. And I sort of think about that as the different levels of sacred resistance. There's not one that's more important than the other. I remember years ago reading about folks who criticized St. Teresa of Calcutta for her focus on the people dying in the streets. You do know that, right? She got critiqued for that, yeah. The critique was that time and resources would be better spent working to dismantle the economic, religious, political, and social systems that led people to be dying on the streets. When faced with this argument, she would often tell of a man who had suggested to her that she could, in fact, do more for the world by teaching people to fish than by giving them fish. And her response was this: the people I serve are helpless. They cannot stand. They cannot hold the rod or the net. I will give them food, and then I will send them to you, and you can teach them how to fish. The point is, I love that because it shows how clear Mother Teresa was about her calling. Her call was to the direct service part. But she was also very aware of the need for the larger work of teaching and of creating self-sufficiency. So it was a both and. She knew her part. And that is really part of what this is about, to be clear about what role, this is part of keeping perspective. What role is God calling you to play? Because when you've got a big crisis, a lot of times what can happen is you go, oh my God, it's terrible, it's big, I don't know what to do. And then what do? Nothing. We do nothing because it's too big and we don't know where to start and da-da-da-da-da. Now, St. Matthew's, I know you people. And I know you are going to go figure out you're going to find something to do because you want to go do something. And that's helpful, that's healthy, that's good. That means you've been formed in this work. But it's important for your own sense of well-being to remember that it is not all up to you. You do not have to do everything. Do what it is you are called to do. Do your part, and remember that you are part of this larger vision and part of this larger community, and that all these other people are going to do their part by the grace of God, and in that way, things will be cared for. I think I'll move on. Okay. One more thing. Just on this point, honestly, I think this thing about keeping, I don't know about you, but over the last couple of years, I've had a lot of people struggling to keep perspective. I think it's important. Is the kind of ways we think about it and the ways we think about how we resource ourselves and our communities to do this work and to not fly off and get pulled into despair or apathy or trying to do too much or whatever. I think this is really important in moments like the one we're living. And I will say, So the other piece around that is please balance bad news with good news. Just a very, very quick point on this. Newspapers and news outlets of all kinds, for the most part, are driven by money. And the money that they get comes from selling papers and having people watch the show. And what is it that sells a lot of times? Sort of the sensationalism, the sort of stuff that's off the charts, the worst possible news. How many times can we show you this terrible, awful thing that we can't take our eyes off of because we're humans and we do that? That is not all there is what I want to say. So there is bad news. We know this. I'm not saying we shouldn't look. We need to pay attention. We need to be informed. We need to be responsive, not reactive. On the other hand, we also need to balance all that bad news with the good news, which is abundant. Oh my God, it's abundant. I want to encourage you in every time you're gathering here or anywhere you go to spend significant time talking about the beautiful good things you have seen either that day or that week or whatever, and give thanks and praise to God for that, because you'll then be reminded of what's real in relation to all the sort of other stuff that's flying around everywhere. Is that right? I'm serious about that. It makes a difference. Okay. And a prayer that you might use, if you follow me on Facebook, some of you might have this one memorized, from the United Methodist hymnal. I post it with some regularity because I think it's a really, 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 really helpful prayer. And it's this. New every morning is your love, great God of light, and all day long you are working for good in the world. Stir up in us a desire to serve you, to live peacefully with our neighbors, and to devote each day to your beloved child, our Savior, Jesus Christ the Lord. It's not a bad way to start every day in terms of keeping perspective. All right? The last practice is love and nonviolence. This is one of the trickiest ones. It's one of the hardest things Jesus teaches us. I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on it because I want to say the one last thing to you that's a little bit more. But we live in a culture that thrives in many ways on violence. Violence sells, again, and violence sells. And we're really called to try to be a people of peace in a culture of violence. And so figuring out in the midst of all of the rancor and the ways that we demonize one another, that we don't give one another the benefit of treating one another with real dignity when we disagree, not having patience with one another, all of those sorts of things that we see so prevalent in these days. we're really called to try to counter that in all the ways that we engage with one another at every level. We know that Jesus calls us to love our enemies. And we know that that call to love does not mean we have to like people, but we are to certainly not to do them harm, to help them perhaps reclaim the dignity of returning to God's way if we feel they're doing harm to others. And so I would just say that we're called to love not only those who suffer at the hands of the oppressors, but we're called to love the oppressors too. That's Matthew 5:43, by the way. And it is instructive, as I've said, to remember that love in its most basic Christian form is not a warm feeling towards another, but it's rather an active expression of care and reverence for life. So we love the oppressor not by liking them, but by naming their inhuman, unjust actions and attitudes and challenging them to repent, to turn and do what is loving and just, and to do that with love and not trying to destroy them. I have a lot of provocative stuff about nonviolence, but we don't have time for that today. I do find, let me just say this. I think that probably one of the biggest taboos, we talk, right now, human sexuality has been the big debate for many years, and whether the fact, our exclusion of LGBTQIA people systemically in the United Methodist Church has been the topic of many of our conversations. But I think that one of the biggest challenges for the church, not just United Methodist Church, but every church in America and probably around the world, is the issue of violence and how we grapple with that. And I think it's almost impossible to talk about in any Christian context. I've given a talk like this in various places, and every time I go into the nonviolence piece, you can just feel the whole place goes. I mean, the energy is funky. So I'm just going to name that, and I'm going to say that at some point, it's an important conversation to have. What do we do? What do we do with the peaceful resistance that we see reflected in Jesus' life? And what does that say to us about how we live in our lives and in our nation, our city? Just going to leave right there. No, I'm not. I'm going to say one more thing that's really provocative. Loving our enemies. Here's what I'm going to say. Woo! Ready? Here we go. Loving our enemies will take many forms. But you can be sure that this is from my book, by the way. Loving our enemies will take many forms, but you can be sure that bullying, slandering, torturing, manipulating, maiming, or killing them is not what Jesus had in mind. Now, putting that in practice in culture, just think about it. Just take it down in there. Okay, I'm going to leave that there. So back to the beginning. We're in a boat over tohu wabohu, big time. By the way, this is not the first time this has happened. Again, keeping it in perspective. There's stuff going on. It's hard stuff in the church and in the world. But friends, this is not the first time we've been here as a human family. God has seen this before. This is our time. This is our stretch of the chaos to traverse. And it is hard work. And God knows it is. And one of the things I've often said is we're in the boat. We only really get into trouble when we forget who's in the boat with us. Who is it we followed to get there? I've blamed Jesus for that in the past. I may have preached that sermon here. It's your fault, Jesus. I wouldn't be in this boat if it weren't for you. Who needs this crap? Anyway. But where I want to leave you today is really something. Again, it's in the book, but it came to me while I was here with all of you. We went through a season here at St. Matthew's where we had it felt like we had a funeral every other week. Do you remember that? I think it was 2000. I don't remember what. Yeah. Well, but there was just a particular stretch. It was like one after another, after another, after another, and I found myself with regularity saying to people, who were coming up and I just said, we hold on to each other, and we trust that God holds on to us. That's all we can do. We hold on to each other and trust that God holds on to us, and that is something that I have just carried forth with me from that moment till this, and it's actually there's a whole chunk of the book that I wrote that has that. We hold on to each other. We hold on to each other because there's so much that we don't have control over, but we can control who we're holding on to. And we have each other. And we can choose whether or not to stay connected in relationship. We have that power. We can choose. Do we stay connected? Do we stay connected to one another? Do we hold on to one another? I started with a poem. I'll end with a poem. You shouldn't be surprised. Hafiz, again, one of my favorites, says, "Out of a great need, we are all holding hands and climbing. Not loving is a letting go. Listen, the terrain around here is far too dangerous for that. Out of a great need, we're all holding hands and climbing. Not loving is a letting go. Listen, the terrain around here is far too dangerous for that. Holding on to one another is what we can do. And participating in God's work of mending in the world, it's a steep climb. And it's a long journey. So remember to care for those closest to you on the way. Hold on to each other. Remember who's in the boat with you. And remember that God's holding on to you. Thanks be to God. Amen.